In the last few days, millions of investors have been watching SpaceX with the same question. What is happening? After years of being considered one of the most promising companies in the world, SpaceX is beginning to face growing doubts. Some see this as just a correction after a period of overheated growth. But others argue that the expectations placed on SpaceX have moved too far from reality. And there are also those who are starting to question whether SpaceX is truly as valuable as the market believes. But there is a bigger question. If SpaceX were just a company, this would only be a story for investors. But if it has become part of America's strategic infrastructure, then this is a story for an entire nation. Recall the financial crisis of 2008. When investment bank Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy, the global financial market fell into chaos. Just a few weeks later, the U.S. Congress passed the $700 billion TARP program to support the financial system and prevent a domino effect. The goal was not to protect the banks. It was to protect the economy from the consequences that could occur if institutions that were too important collapsed. From that, a famous concept emerged. Too big to fail. But today, perhaps we need a new concept. Not too big, but too important. And that leads to a thought-provoking question. Is SpaceX becoming the first company of the space era that the U.S. cannot afford to let fail? What role does SpaceX actually play in America today? You could view SpaceX as a tech company, and perhaps as Elon Musk's rocket company. Investors often look at it as a growth asset, similar to what happened with Tesla. But when you look at what SpaceX is actually doing, the picture is very different. In 2026, the U.S. Space Force awarded SpaceX 5 out of the 7 national security launch missions for the year. The value of these contracts is approximately $714 million. These are not ordinary commercial satellites. These are missions involving national security, defense systems, and America's strategic space capabilities. In other words, most of the most critical missions are being handed to a private company. And SpaceX doesn't just appear in the defense sector. In another arena, NASA still continues to rely on the Falcon 9 and the Dragon spacecraft to take astronauts to the International Space Station. The Crew 11 mission is the latest example. This means that from defense to civil space programs, SpaceX is appearing in positions that previously belonged to state agencies or long-standing aerospace corporations. Not only are they launching more, but SpaceX also holds a series of missions signed for many years to come from commercial clients, the U.S. government, and defense programs. That creates a quite special reality. While many companies have to constantly search for new customers to maintain growth, a significant portion of SpaceX's future operations was scheduled years ago. And for investors, this could be the first sign that SpaceX possesses a layer of protection that most other businesses do not have. And it is from here that the view on risk begins to change. Because usually, if a tech company faces difficulties, the ones most affected are the shareholders. But if a company tasked with military missions, national space programs, and a portion of the country's strategic capabilities runs into trouble, the impact will not stop at the financial market. At this point, the story begins to change. Because perhaps SpaceX is no longer merely a business selling products to customers. It is gradually becoming a part of the system by which America operates its future. And if you are an investor, perhaps the most important question is no longer how fast SpaceX will grow, but rather, if SpaceX is operating a part of America's future, are you investing in a business or into an asset that the government cannot afford to lose? And if that is true, then another question starts to appear. If SpaceX is too important to fail, is it still a risky investment, or is it gradually becoming an asset that the system is forced to keep alive? By now, many might think, fine, SpaceX is very important. But at the end of the day, it is still just a rocket launch company. If one day SpaceX hits a crisis, another company will take its place. In theory, the free market always creates competition. When a company becomes too strong, new competitors will appear. But the space industry is creating a different question. If SpaceX cannot be replaced immediately, is this market still truly a free market? But things might not be that simple. Because SpaceX today doesn't just sell satellite launch services. This company is participating in building the very systems that America wants to use for the next several decades. One example is the contract worth approximately $2.29 billion that SpaceX received from the U.S. Space Force in 2026. The goal is not to launch a few more rockets. It is to build a military data transmission network in space. This system is designed to connect satellites, missile warning sensors, and defense platforms into a network that operates almost in real time. In other words, SpaceX is gradually participating in the infrastructure layers behind modern defense operations. And this is the point that many investors often overlook. The value of a business does not just lie in its revenue or profit. Sometimes it lies in a simpler question. If that company disappeared, could anyone replace it immediately? In a free market, most businesses are replaceable. The only question is how long it takes. But when a business starts participating in strategic programs that span decades, replacing it is no longer a matter of the market. It becomes a matter of time, cost, and national security. At that point, SpaceX will stand in a very different position. Not the position of a company trying to become important, but the position of a company that more and more organizations do not want to lose. And if that continues to happen, investors might have to ask themselves a new question. Does SpaceX's greatest value lie in what the company earns? Or does it lie in the degree to which America depends on it? There is a fairly common misunderstanding about SpaceX. That is, the US government is choosing SpaceX because it is a better contractor than other competitors. But if you look deeper into how the budget and defense programs operate, the story is not that simple. In fields like space and national security, most spending is not decided contract by contract. It is built around long-term programs, with specific capability goals for the entire system. Once a company has been integrated into those programs, they are no longer just bidding. They become a part of the deployment plan. And this is when the cash flow starts to take on a different nature. According to the Washington Post, companies linked to Elon Musk have received about $38 billion from the US government through contracts, subsidies, tax credits, and other financial support. Of that, SpaceX and Tesla alone account for about $22.5 billion in direct contracts. And another approximately $11.8 billion in contracts are still in future deployment plans. But the important thing is not the scale of these numbers. It is the structural nature of them. This is not cash flow coming from a free market, where customers can leave at any time. It is cash flow tied to budget goals that were defined years in advance. That creates a very special effect. In a normal market, businesses must compete to win customers. But in strategic programs, a business only needs to be institutionalized within the system. And once in that system, the question is no longer who is cheaper or who is better. But rather, can we make changes without disrupting the entire plan? This is a point that many investors often misjudge. They look at SpaceX as a company growing through technology and capability. But in reality, a major part of SpaceX's cash flow comes from the fact that it has been anchored to plans where pulling it out is no longer as simple as a normal business decision. And when that happens, SpaceX is no longer in the position of being chosen. It is in the position of being institutionalized. And the difference between the two is what changes the entire view of the risk and value of this company. This is perhaps the biggest paradox in the whole story. The government is paying tens of billions of dollars to SpaceX to execute critical missions. But as more and more strategic capabilities are handed over to SpaceX, a question starts to emerge. If the government needs SpaceX to operate the future, then who is ultimately depending on whom? To understand the real level of risk, we don't need to imagine SpaceX disappearing. We just need to look at how much the current system depends on it. Currently, SpaceX is performing the majority of America's critical launch missions. According to the US Space Force, SpaceX won about 5 out of 7 national security launch missions in 2026, including military satellites and strategic warning systems. Meanwhile, NASA still depends on the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon to get astronauts to the International Space Station. The Commercial Crew program alone is valued at about $4.9 billion signed with SpaceX. Now let's make an assumption. If SpaceX encountered a serious, prolonged technical issue or had its operations disrupted for a significant period of time, the first thing to be affected would be the launch schedules of both NASA and the US Department of Defense. And this is not a far-fetched hypothesis. Historically, just a single failed launch has caused US space programs to be delayed for months to investigate and re-verify the entire system. For example, After the Challenger disaster in 1986, NASA had to halt the entire space shuttle program for nearly 3 years. Now back to the present. Unlike back then, the majority of America's commercial launch infrastructure is currently concentrated in a small number of providers, with SpaceX at the center. This means that if SpaceX were disrupted, the system does not have many immediate alternatives with the same capability and launch frequency. And this is why SpaceX's contracts are not just commercial. They are also a matter of ensuring national capability. Because in reality, replacing a launch system is not measured in weeks or months, but in years of development, testing, and safety certification. And during that time, space and defense programs must still continue to operate. That is the point that creates the real pressure. It is not about whether SpaceX is important or not. It is about how long the system can endure if SpaceX is disrupted. When a company reaches a level of integration deep enough with critical systems, the way the market values it begins to change. It is no longer just what percentage is the growth, and no longer how is this quarter's profit. But another question that investors are beginning to pay more attention to is the stable existence of this company becoming a part of the operational expectations of the entire system. Among analysts, this is when a controversial hypothesis appears. Some investors call it the state of implicit guarantee, meaning there is no formal commitment, but the market begins to price the company as if the risk of bankruptcy is lower than normal. Not because the company is safer, but because the cost of letting it fail is viewed as too high compared to the benefit of letting the market self-correct. And when an asset enters that valuation zone, investment behavior changes accordingly. Cash flow does not just reflect business performance. It begins to reflect expectations regarding the irreproducibility of the position the company holds in the system. This is why some long-term investors no longer ask, "Is it risky?" but shift to a more subtle question. If a problem occurs, how will the system adjust to maintain stability? And it is this very change in how the question is asked that is the clearest sign that the way the market is viewing risk is no longer the same as before. Because when a company begins to be valued not just as a business, but as a part of a stable structure, then the line between investment and the assumption of system stability begins to blur very quickly. And if this logic holds, then the problem is no longer whether SpaceX is valued high or low. It is also no longer whether it is risky or not, but rather that we are entering a new phase of the market where certain companies are no longer valued solely based on financial results, but on the degree to which they are impossible to remove from the system. And once that happens, the most important question is no longer, should I invest or not? But rather, are we looking at a stock, or are we looking at something that is gradually becoming the very structure of the modern economy?